All right, this morning we'll start off with a joke. This couple is not really having much of a relationship recently. They're not really having much conversation. In fact, they haven't been speaking to each other at all. And the thing is, the husband in this case, we'll call him Carl. Carl has got a flight early the next morning, and he is notorious for not being able to wake up on time. And his wife usually wakes him up, but because they haven't been speaking late, he's not going to tell her. He doesn't want to break the silence here. So he writes a note and says, "Mary, can you please wake me up tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock for my flight?" Next morning, he wakes up. The sun is bright. It looks at his watch. It's 8 o'clock. He absolutely missed his flight. And he hears his wife in the kitchen. He's wondering what happened. He looks, turns around, and sees a little note on the pillow. It says, "Carl, get up. It's 5 o'clock." So I actually hate these jokes. I hate those kind of jokes because of the fact that, they're indicative of people's issues in relationships. And to me, that's a real tragedy. But like we've been discussing, there's a methodology to being able to create this relationship in the way that it's sensible and it works in accordance with the way we were created. And when we understand the way we were created and we apply that into our relationship, we're capable of being able to avoid these kind of issues. You understand the system, and when you work within the system, things typically work better. And so that's really what we've been discussing. So, of course, when it comes down to it, what we've discussed in the Mimer so far is this back and forth, the male, of course, giving, the female receiving, and as a result, the two of them getting to a higher place, to a greater place. And that has all the different references, when we said with regards to, physical pregnancy, that's the process. With regards to the relationship in general, with regards to Shabbat, with regards to all the different elements of that we've been discussing. Royalty, the king receives from the people, and as a result, he's able to build roads, and that's what Malchut is all about. So that's really all been a clarification of the previous Rebbe's Mimer until now. Now, the Rebbe is going to take it one step further. He's going to open up another area that was alluded to in the previous Rebbe's Mimer, but the Rebbe really takes this down to a much deeper level. And it's very interesting, just on the side, I was talking to somebody about this Mimer, and this person pointed out that the previous Rebbe's Mimer really focuses on the spiritual aspect of Zah, or Yisod. Zah being the male aspect, Yisod being the final sphera that has a direct emotional input, as opposed to Malchut, which is, of course, like we said, the feminine aspect, and has a much more ethereal, much more broad element to itself. And the Rebbe's Mimer, as we're going to see, is very much focused on Malchut, the recipient. And the point that my friend noted is that the previous Rebbe is, of course, the sixth Rebbe, and Yisod is the sixth Sphira, and the Rebbe is the seventh Rebbe of the dynasty, and the seventh Sphira is Malchut. So it would make sense that the two of them would focus on, so to speak, the aspect that is most applicable to their own generation, to their own leadership. So that itself was a very interesting aspect. So in chapter 6, where are we? Chapter 5, sorry. So now we return to the spiritual analog, the transmission of Zah to Malchut. So Zah, like we said, is the specific attributes, the specific emotional attributes that are prior to Malchut, and they reference the male, the giving aspect. They have individual energies, individual emotions, and Malchut, like we said, is much more broad. And this transmission of Zat to Malchut, which reflects upon the physical union of male and female. Now he points out something very, very important. The truth is that the divine source of Malchut is far greater than the source of Zah. So there's an element of this flow of creation in which we see how things are to the end user. One thing follows the next and eventually comes down here. And with regards to that, you see the system. And in terms of that, you see that, of course, Chesed is prior to Gvura. Gvura is prior to Tiferet. Tiferet is prior to Netzach. Netzach is prior to Hod. Then it goes down to Yisod. And then finally, the last Sphira is, of course, Malchut. But the truth of the matter is that in their source, Malchut is on a completely different plane. Malchut is much, 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 much higher. Okay? And the Rebbe points out that Malchut stems from the internal aspect of Keter, which is called Atik, while Zah only reaches back to the external aspect of Keter. So Keter, if we're going back into this Kabbalistic reference, Keter is that which is prior to Chachma. Keter, of course, means a crown. We discussed this briefly in the past, but of course we need to review it. Keter means a crown. The crown is, of course, not part of the person. It's above the person, and it's beyond the person. And it's not just a physical crown. It's something that is representative of something much, much, much greater. Likewise, within a person, you have our individual aspects of ourself and our systems as we think and as we feel. So Chachma and Bina and Dat are very, very specific. They're frameworks through which our soul focuses on. They're referred to as levushim. They're referred to as garments, because garments, of course, you can put on, take on and off. You can change your garments based on what you feel like. If you're going golfing, you wear a certain type of clothes. If you're going to shul, you're wearing another type of clothes. And if of course, you end up at shul wearing your golf clothes, everybody will think, what happened to you? You're obviously, you mixed up your wardrobe. And because different aspects of yourself are expressing themselves in different ways. But Keter is beyond. Keter reflects on this idea of transcendence. And there are two aspects of Keter. You have the external aspect of Keter, which is referred to as Arich. And you have the internal aspect of Keter, which is called Atik. The framework within ourselves is that the two of these are will and pleasure. And again, when we talk about will and we talk about pleasure, we're not talking about physical will, physical pleasure. We're talking about the deepest elements of ourselves, and our deepest drives, our deepest need for accomplishment. And then when we talk about pleasure, we're talking about certainly not the pleasure of, eating cake or something like that, but a much deeper pleasure, a pleasure of the sense within one's own self. The pleasure that comes from the result of something much bigger than just a momentary pleasure of eating something or feeling good about something physical. The pleasure of being, the pleasure of course, of, let's say, family or having a purpose and living your purpose and all those kinds of elements that are much, much deeper and not specific to one particular aspect of life. When you're eating something, you have pleasure that's input into specifically your mouth. You feel full, then obviously then your stomach feels good. You're playing sports, and then of course there's a certain element of drive and excitement, but only with regards to certain parts of the body, shall we say. And likewise with any other element of pleasure. But when we're talking about this level of pleasure, that's our deepest element of pleasure, we're talking about something that is much, much greater and much less specific. Za, the male aspect, finds itself rooted in will. And this is very, very interesting because in terms of how men work, men need to feel driven, and they need to apply their drive into their world. And that's an essential element of who men are. The female comes from a much higher place, from a much, much deeper place, and a much more subtle place, and that is pleasure. And that pleasure is very not specific. They have the ability to be able to create because of the fact that they come from a greater place in godliness. That because of the fact they come to it from a greater source. But it's not just even this concept of Atik itself, but as we're going to see, it's even greater than that. It's actually the very most innermost element of Atik, as we're going to see. The Rebbe says parenthetically, for those of you Kabbalists out there, he says, while the Zohar does say that Za is unified with Atik, that does not refer to Atik. It only refers to its outermost elements. In other words, the male, of course, does have some relationship with the idea of pleasure, but only the most external elements of it, and not the internal elements of it. The source of Malchut, however, goes all the way to the deepest, hiddenmost element of Atik, which is called Reisha Dilo Et Yada, which means the head that cannot be known. And we'll explain how this applies into reality in just a few moments, and I think it's very, very important. And he continues and says, it is only because of the descent of Malchut that its source becomes concealed and afterwards can only be revealed through its interaction with Zah. So what is this Reisha Dilo Et Yada? Reisha Dilo Et Yada is like we said, it's the hiddenmost, it's the very most subtle element of pleasure. Basically, we describe pleasure as something that oftentimes people are running after, and it can't exactly be pinpointed. It's like the God particle is that which, something that cannot be found in this place or that place. We only know that it's between these two places. Reisha Dilo Et Yada is a source of complete and absolute mystique. And it's something that absolutely cannot be pinpointed. And from this, we understand the power of femininity is in its mystique. And so now getting back to every single joke that's ever been said about marriage, it's oftentimes because of the fact that the male does not understand that the female is coming from this place of subtlety, this place of mystique, and it's the lack of understanding itself that makes who she is. And when we understand that and we recognize that and we cherish that, we allow the feminine to be truest to herself and to truly be herself. But in our world, in the very, very modern world, you find the opposite, that women are being forced into absolute revelation, so to speak, forced into becoming or expressing themselves in a male type way, when in fact, who they are is the mystique itself. And when the male recognizes that this mystique is something much greater than himself, he's able to tap into something that is far higher. He recognizes that she has capabilities and talents and a capacity that is far beyond his, but it's his capability to be able to focus them in individual areas that is what he should be doing. And then, like we say at the end of this paragraph, it is as a result of this interaction that Malchut rises even higher than himself. That as a result of how the male elicits these talents and capabilities from the female, that you're able to see this greatness of Malchut. They're able to see that that Malchut is not lower than the male. It's in fact far higher. And this is something that actually will be revealed when Mashiach comes. And that's the reason why we say the words Eshet Chayil Ateret Bala, that a wife of valor is the crown of her husband, that she's actually far beyond. And it's only when Mashiach comes that the source of femininity will be revealed. And this is encapsulated with regards to all the other elements of Mashiach. All the other elements of Mashiach are about the Jewish people and what we gave to God, so to speak. The feminine aspect being revealed. The Shechina, God's feminine aspect, once again being revealed. So it's very, very funny because, of course, in Judaism, Judaism is oftentimes accused of being, patriarchal, paternalistic, sexist, and all that kind of thing. But that's only for somebody who looks at the very, 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 very external element of it. On this deeper element, it's this deeper recognition of the greatness of the female, and that the male is meant to try to elicit. And the process, of course, in Judaism is that the male approaches the female. This then, the Rebbe continues, is the reason for the sequence of the transmission. First, Zah must interact with Malchut in such a way that Zah is higher than Malchut. You might think of it as in the, like we said, the teacher analog. And the Talmud even says, Derech ha-ish lichbosh. It is the way for the male to conquer, so to speak. The male needs to go out and attract the female, just in very, very simplistic terms. And in that way, the male is higher. It is only in this way that Malchut's lofty source can be reached and revealed. But at this point, the transmission is coming only because of Zah's vantage point. At that point, it remains tethered to Ishtalshus. So at this point, it remains within a very limited space. It remains only within this simplistic approach of male downwards, so to speak. It is only through the internal transmission, in other words, through the external element of the male approaching the female, everything remains within the basic schematic of nature, within the world, so to speak, male dominance, so to speak. And that's an extremely limited place to be. It is only through the internal transmission in which Malchut absorbs the transmission and internalizes it that the source of Malchut, far beyond the source of Zah, can be reached. So the actual impregnation is a process that is not just a physical process, but it is something that is allowing the feminine to reach a far greater level, which is bringing life into this world. Imitating, so to speak, God himself. And as a result of this, Malchut becomes capable of influencing Zah in such a way that a virtuous wife becomes the crown of her husband, Eshet Chai Ateret Bala. As a result of this process, she becomes the foundation of everything. She reaches her ultimate source, and her ultimate source is, in fact, beyond the male. Again, in the schematic of a family, of course, I'm the head of my household. My wife is the neck. She tells me where to turn, right? In the schematic of a family, there's a recognition that the mother has a tremendous power, which is far greater than the father's. Well, that's the reality of it. And this has very little to do with, so to speak, who's wearing the pants in the family or anything like that. It has everything to do with the systems in which Hashem created the world. And that there is an advantage to the male. There is a greater advantage in the female, and the two of them work in such a way that they're able to bring out the greatest qualities in both of them. And that's done through the male recognizing what his responsibilities are and his relationship vis-a-vis the female, and recognizing her greatness over him and trying to elicit that through how he treats her. And the same thing, of course, on the other side, Malchut understanding her responsibility, her recognition of her husband, her understanding of her need to be able to absorb, to receive, and to create as a result of that. Of course, it's not just with regards to intimacy, it's with regards to the entire relationship. It's with regard to the entire experience of life itself. So before we go any further, I'd like to open up the floor to questions and comments. Sure, Mr. Robert.
Yeah, I'm just, again, when you say you're the head of the household and your wife tells you which way to turn, in my fat Greek wedding, whatever it was called, the father says, I'm the head of the household and my wife is the neck. And so the implication is she directs him where to turn and stuff like that, which is apropos to most of us who are married, right?
And that's correct. And that should not be something that is looked at negatively. It's an understanding of how the systems work together. It's an understanding what we elicit from the female and and of course I'm saying we because I'm the male here. If I was a female teacher in the class, it would be slightly different. But what the understanding is also in terms of what the female receives from the male and is able to do with that and is able to accomplish with that. So there's recognition that the systems are not simplistic. In certain elements, in certain frameworks, yes, the male is the head, the male is the leader, the male is, so to speak, it's a bad term for it, but lack of other terms, aggressive, so to speak, the instigator, maybe, if you want to put it that way. That's the way the male was set up. But if the male only reflects in that kind of way and does not recognize the qualities of the female and what she needs to do with what he brings into the system, then it's going to be a failed relationship. If the male is capable of being able to recognize what his wife brings as a result of what he brings to her, and where she brings the two of them and where she brings the broader world at large, he's able to access something much greater. His drive, her internal pleasure, need to be linked up. And he needs to be able to elicit that. And he does that through things that, of course, on a very, very, very practical side of things, that bring her pleasure. And that's what is fascinating, is absolutely fascinating, that in Judaism, the husband has the mitzvah of onah. And the mitzvah of onah is bringing her pleasure. The ketubah, if you read the ketubah, is completely on the husband. And the husband has to give his wife clothes. The husband has to bring his wife food. And it's quite implicit in there that he needs to give his wife chocolate. That's the word chocolate is not found in the ketubah, but I believe that it's part of it. He needs to understand where she is and who she is and what her systems are. And that's how he's able to elicit her greatness, which is far beyond his. And so it's not at all, patriarchal. It's not even matriarchal. It's about the systems and how they work together. Now, of course, in the media, that doesn't sell, because the idea is too, in the world at large, they look at everything in the most simplistic way possible. And they don't want to hear this. But for ourselves, when we look at Judaism, we understand that this is what it's all about. And that the feminine is coming from a much greater source. And her source is mystique. And so therefore, men have very specific mitzvot, very detailed. Put on tefillin at this time. You may not put on tefillin after this time. Put on tzitzit at this time. After this time is not the time for tzitzit. Likewise, with regards to everything else that men are responsible for, is very specific. With regards to women, it's a lot broader, because women are not about specifics. They're much more about mystique. Much more, the mitzvot for women are much more the spiritual type, much more the broader type. Go ahead, Robert.
Yes, I'd like to expand on what you're saying, and if I understand correctly, because now over generations, the relationship between husband and wife have changed. And clearly the times that we live in is more, clearly it's a relationship, but also it's an informed relationship in being, if I can say, a partnership, that by living together and forming a Jewish family, the husband is the head of the family, but again, the wife contributes to the management of the family without it necessarily being rigid, I guess is the word I'm trying to say. And that's acceptable within our contemporary times. We jokingly say, I'm the head and she's the neck or whatever it is, but it's clearly we're raising a family. We both have a responsibility to each other and to the family and to the Jewish community to be compatible, as well as to continue to perform and practice the mitzvot within Judaism. So is that something that's acceptable in interpreting how we evolve as a contemporary Jewish family?
Yeah, but I would say that this goes right back to the source of Judaism, and that it always has meant to be this way. And there are very, very, very slight subtexts that you can pick up that, for example, the Jewish people are referred to in general as Bnei Israel. But when God is telling Moshe to speak to the Jewish people right before Mount Sinai, the very first thing he says is speak to Beit Yisrael. And the question is, who is the house of Israel? And the Talmud explains that Beit Yisrael is actually the Jewish women. First, you need to speak to the Jewish women because you need to get their okay first. There's an understanding that they will be the main
Conduit, let's
creators,
say,
the main, what was that?
conduit. They're the conduit to the activities, the action that's happening within the family.
Correct.
We have a bad connection, so yeah, okay.
So that's absolutely correct, and that's really what it's all about. There's an understanding, but it's found within subtlety. It's found within that very, very vague elements, because that's where women come from, because that's their spiritual source.
Right. Just not to deviate, I'm living within a Spanish-speaking country now, and when you have a crowd of both male and female, the adjective is male. So that becomes the accepted adjective to describe a group. So if it's men and women, then it becomes chicos, not chicas or any other name in between. So again, it's understanding that it's not implied as being sexist necessarily, but that's the way the construction is set to understand a mixed gender group.
Correct. And that's also applicable within Hebrew. And again, so to be able to elicit the idea of what the female is much more subtle, because of the fact that that's where they're coming from.
Yeah,
so
that's good. Right, a lot of people and again, understanding that is the basis for the relationships. That's all. A lot of people still don't understand that because of sort of like Fiddler in the Roof tradition, and who's in charge and stuff like that. But clearly, the wife, influenced Tevia's actions.
And that's the way it's supposed to be. That the wife is meant to influence, and that's the system. So again, it's a two-way system. There's a recognition of what the male responsibility is, there's a recognition of what the female responsibility is, and there's a recognition of how the two of them can come to a place where both of them are much greater, much happier, and have grown as a result. So that's where we're going, and we'll discuss it a little bit more and probably finish it off this Friday, God willing. So have a wonderful week. Thanks again for your time. Sorry for going a little bit overboard, Rabbi Smith.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Pleasure.
Thank you.